Okay, now I'm going to talk about planning for a project and consistency a little bit. I'm assuming by this stage you can pretty much spin whatever thickness of yarn you want, or at least get close by varying where you're pinching. Now, you often hear people say, oh, I don't plan what I'm going to spin my yarn into. I let the fibre tell me what it's going to be. And that's fine if you're happy with ending up with a big pile of yarn that maybe in a weight that you don't like knitting with, maybe you don't have enough for a single project, or for any other reason it may end up just sitting in your stash. I do that sometimes, but generally I prefer a more purposive approach to my spinning. Doesn't mean necessarily that I measure everything in sight, just means I go in with an idea of what I'm going to be making. Like this. Some of you will have seen me spinning for this when I was testing out the 6, when I just got it, doing various different art yarns. I did this one here that has lights spun into it, and then I did some super coils and some singles, and I mixed this up with some other yarns I already had in my stash and made this wall hanging. Now, I didn't measure any thicknesses or anything. The only purpose I went into this with was I was going to spin some lights and make some art yarns to go with them in a woven piece. So that was my my intent, and it turned out quite well. The light in here is a little bit bright for you to see the LED lights, but it looks very nice at night. Now I'm going to show you a few other of my pieces and talk about the thought process that went into the yarns behind them. So first I have this. This is a vest top, and this was knit from a singles yarn. Generally I would advise against singles because they aren't as strong as applied yarn. They're not very abrasion resistant, and your finished object just won't last as long. However, this, I wanted to preserve the lovely colour sequence. It's quite a lightweight yarn, so I didn't necessarily want to spin a third of the thickness of this and then chain ply it. And because it's a vest, there are no areas that it can rub on itself. There's no underarm areas or anything like that. So I thought I would give it a go. I made my singles perhaps slightly tighter than they needed to be to stay together, and then I fooled it slightly in the wet finishing process, hoping that any major changes with the yarn would happen while I was wet finishing before I knitted it. So this is several years old now, and it's still looking pretty good. There's no noticeable pilling, so I'm happy with this. In contrast, over here I have another sweater. This is also singles. This was not hand spun. This was a commercial yarn, and it's pilling terribly. There's a little bit here up around the armpits, and there is absolutely loads on the sleeves. So while I can sit and pull all these pills off, for such a large cardigan that I put a lot of work into, I really should have thought better about my yarn choices and picked something a little bit more hard wearing. Next thing I have here is this required a lot of sampling. Not only to get the yarn the right thickness, but also to work out the colours. I had some of this white corridale and I had some dark grey corridale, and I wanted to add tiny little rainbow speckles of recycled sari silk. I wasn't sure how much sari silk I needed to get the effect I wanted, so I sampled on the grey and I sampled on the white, and I found out that I needed less on the white to give the same visual impact than I did on the grey. So I think I ended up doing about 5% by weight with the white and 10% by weight with the grey. Trying it, various other combinations. I have lots of little squares about this big, and this is what turned out the best for me. So I'm very happy I sampled with that. I think you can probably see the speckles. And this one here, I bought a beautiful rainbow hand-dyed braid at a fibre festival. I knew I wanted to spin it into a yoke sweater. I couldn't afford enough hand-dyed fibre to spin an entire sweater, I mean 400 grams-ish, but I could afford a single braid and then mix that with a plain colour that is cheaper to get a really good sweater. So I found a pattern that I wanted, and it was fingering weight yarn. I checked how much yarn I'd need, and I hoped that I would have enough to be able to do this contrast on the sleeves as well. So my plan was essentially spin 4-ply yarn and knit until it runs out. Start at the yoke. If it runs out here, well, that's a shame. If I've still got some left, I can do the sleeves. And as it was, I still had a little bit left after that, so I did a contrast hem. And finally, I have this. This was far less planned. It was planned to the point that I think I'd got 400-ish grams of fibre, dyed it by throwing blues and purples at it, and spun it to fingering weight, knowing I'd want to make a sweater out of it. Then it sat in my stash for quite a long time until I found a suitable fingering weight sweater that would look nice with the semi-random Marley sort of pattern of the yarn. Okay, so you've seen some of the decisions you will need to make while planning your projects, whether it be colour related or getting enough length out of a expensive bit of fibre, or whether you're doing singles or plying. Now I'll talk about how you actually maintain that consistency. So I've got a bit of an example here. This is my current project sample card. I am currently spinning for a 4-ply sock yarn of a similar weight to commercial sock yarn. So what I did was I got some commercial sock yarn and dismantled it. I took it apart, and this green strand here is a single ply from a 4-ply commercial sock yarn. I then spun a few samples to try and match the thickness of that, and this one here is my singles that to my eye is as good as the same thickness as this one. This here is a single of this folded in half and plied back on itself, so this is essentially a 2-ply ply back, and this here is 4-ply, which is what my final yarn's going to look like. So what I do as I'm spinning, I keep this either to the side of me, or if I'm trying to be really accurate, I'll even keep it in front of me and draft past it, and I'll be constantly comparing my singles to this strand here. Every now and then when I stop to either move the guides or deal with a cat or something, I will then fold my fresh singles in half and line it up against this, and that way I'll be able to check the thickness and check the angle of twist too. Here my eyesight is not good enough to see the angle of twist on this, or indeed count the twist per inch, but I can look at this and put another yarn next to it and go, yeah, that's about the same, needs a little bit more, needs a bit less. So I don't measure my angle of twist. If I wanted to measure my angle of twist, I have this little card here, and you can even see on it, there's a picture. You take your yarn and line it up, the diagonal line it up whichever of these lines it's closest to, and that's your twist angle. I don't generally measure it like that and write it down. I just compare it against this and go, yeah, it needs more or less, and that's good enough for all the projects I do. And as well, yeah, I said I compare to actual yarn. You can compare it to a measurement here. This is wraps per inch. This would be where you take some yarn and wrap it round a ruler or a card or something that measures an inch, and you can wrap with these wraps just pushed together, but not too squished and not too tight. And generally this requires lots of messing around, and you might find that you measure it different day to day. Different people certainly measure it different day to day. So I tend not to measure wraps per inch by actually wrapping. If you look at this card, it's got printed on it different wraps per inch thicknesses, and I found it slightly more accurate to lay my yarn over it. So that's about 40. You can see it's 30 line is just a little bit bigger, but the 40 yarn is about the same. So I'll check my wraps per inch against a card perhaps, or more likely against a sample of a known yarn that I want to achieve. Now if I have a known thickness that I want to achieve, but I don't have a yarn to compare against, what I'll do is, this is my own control card that I made myself that has slightly finer yarns. On the back it's got a little bit of a cheat sheet. It says for a 2-ply yarn, singles wraps per inch should be approximately 3/2, 1.5 times the desired final wraps per inch. For a 3-ply yarn, the singles wraps per inch should be approximately twice the desired final wraps per inch. And I've got a list of various weights here. So if I want to make a double net weight yarn, I know that that will be, once it's wet finished, somewhere between 12 and 14 wraps per inch. So if I want that to be 3-ply, my singles wraps per inch need to be twice that. So my singles need to be 24 to 28 wraps per inch, and that'll give me a good starting point. So I will look here, right, though 24 to 28 is somewhere between the 25 and 30. I would spin my singles and fold it in half. I've shown you how to do a 2-ply ply back simply by folding in half like that and letting the twist into it. Now this isn't letting much twist into it because it's an old yarn, but I'll just fold it in half. If I want to do a 3-ply ply back, I will hold like that and make 3 strands next to each other. I don't know if you saw that. Let's do that again. So, and open round the thumb, round that finger. Then here I have 3 strands next to each other. So I would grab them at the bottom, grab them at the top, and push them together. And then if this was a very active twisty yarn, that would twist back on itself and show me what my finished 3-ply yarn would look like, which I can then compare against either of these control cards and check whether it is in my 12 to 14 range of double knit. If it's not, then I would do it again. If it's close, then I would probably make a foot or 2 and wash them, because the second the yarn gets wet it can fluff up. If it's a very tight, dense worsted sort of yarn from a long wool breed, it might not fluff up very much at all. If it's a really fluffy long draw style yarn from a down breed, that's going to fluff up loads and loads. So good to keep a sample of wet finished and unfinished yarn. You refer to your unfinished yarn while you're spinning, but your wet finished yarn is what it's going to look like when you start knitting with it. And that is all I really measure. You can count twists per inch. It's far harder to do on something so small, so I'll show you on here. So I have this ply back here. If I wanted to be really consistent with this yarn, line that up there and say I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. I've got 4 twists per inch with that yarn. Now if I measured that over a longer distance, obviously I'd get a better result, but I don't tend to measure my TPI that often. I will just, as I said before, look at my angle of twist. If you want to measure twist per inch and write it down, measure your angle of twist, measure your WPI, you can do all of that, but you don't have to be consistent for a project. All you have to do is have a target and keep checking your progress against that target, whether that target be a little bit of yarn, stuff taped to a card, or some control cards with lots of numbers on. That's entirely up to you. The important thing is you keep checking that you're not going off track. And that's really all there is to it, the basics of project planning and record keeping. So if you have any questions on any of this, do let me know in the comments.